We have such a blessed, sort of shorter story this morning and into this evening. And so I was thinking through this story. I heard back about a few years ago, I heard this story that in 1984, a golden Irish beach completely disappeared in a series of storms, North Atlantic storms that had kind of rocked the Irish coast, and it left only jagged rocks and completely inhospitable piece of coastline in a former tourist town. Now, it was a devastating blow. I mean, the village's beautiful seashore that had brought tourism, it had even brought food. It became a memory for so many people of better times of when the town was vibrant, And the jagged, unwelcome shore sparked bitterness in a lot of people about the good old times being gone. And then, 30 years later, I don't know if you can tell much by this, but 30 years later, in 2017, just at Easter, a freak tide instantly restored the beach with thousands and thousands of tons of beautiful sand, recreating again that stretch of beach. It's amazing. So the one on the left is the devastation, and the one on the right is the sand. All came back up. You can look it up at some point. Irish coast disappears, but it's just jagged rocks. It's something you really want to be anywhere near. And one imagines life in this sort of way, going through such a brutal and horrible storm and never recovering again, because that's what people thought had happened. The sand's washed away. We've lost our beautiful thing in life, and it's gone forever. And I know there's lots of people who have gone through sudden storms in life, gone through pretty difficult things in life, and they feel jagged, and they feel beaten, and they feel aimless, and they feel like many of the great things in life just got washed away. It's just gone. Life went from full color and dampened into black and white. For others, it doesn't happen so quickly. There's beaches, we know that there's slow erosion, and it fades out the beauty, the purpose, and the hope. They all become a stale memory of our lives. Maybe it happened in a relationship for you. Maybe it happened at work. Maybe it happened to your faith, or your children's faith, or your loved one's faith. Maybe it's happened to your health. And it gets you to this point where you say, what is this all about anyway? What am I doing here? And maybe like one person in our story, the man in our story today, you never really even got a shot. Because there's some people, they don't really ever get a shot. We're going to talk about a man who's been paralyzed for a very long time. Maybe you're like this woman we'll talk about today, where all the effort that she had put into life and to ministry just disappeared in tragedy in a moment. Maybe you know somebody, if it's not you, who needs restoration like that beautiful shore. But you know that it's going to take a lot more than a fortuitous tide to bring it back to you, to change your heart and mind and restore you. You need hope. Hope is blowing in your direction this morning. Hope is blowing toward you this morning by the Holy Spirit. Just like it blew that day that we're going to talk about toward Lydda and Joppa. Centuries ago, as the Holy Spirit guided Peter off to this fresh life and hope to a battered church, to battered people. We're going to talk about this morning connecting with Jesus. Ministry belongs to Jesus, and keeping your spiritual heart beating. So let's look at the story this morning from Acts chapter 9. About God coming and touching our lives again, about Him being the center of it and being the breath of life we need. Acts chapter 9, 32 through 43. Now as Peter was traveling through all those regions, so this is right, I'm just by the catch you up real quick. This happens just after Paul's conversion and Paul goes to Tarsus. This is the next story. So we're moving from Paul's conversion to this story. Now, as Peter was traveling through all those regions, he came down also to the saints who lived in Lydda. And there he found a man named Aeneas, who had been bedridden 8 years, for he was paralyzed. And Peter said to him, Aeneas, Jesus Christ heals you. Get up and make your bed. Immediately he got up And all who lived at Lydda and Sharon saw him, and they turned to the Lord. Now in Joppa, there was a disciple named Tabitha, which translated in Greek is called Dorcas, which means gazelle. Now this woman was abounding with deeds of kindness and charity, which she continually did. And it happened at that time that she fell sick and died. And when they had washed her body, they laid it in an upper room. And since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples, having heard that Peter was there, sent 2 men to him, imploring him, "Do not delay in coming to us." So Peter arose, and he went with them. And when he arrived, they brought him into the upper room, and all the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing all the tunics and all the amazing garments that Dorcas used to make while she was with them. But Peter sent them all out. He knelt down and prayed. And turning to the body, he said, "Tabitha, arise." And she opened her eyes. And when she saw Peter, she sat up. And he gave her his hand and raised her up. And calling the saints and widows, he presented her alive. It became known all over Joppa, and many people believed in the Lord. And Peter stayed many days in Joppa with a tanner named Simon. First of all, Jesus is the source of getting up. Jesus is the source of getting up. He is the source of the impossible. In the last section, Jesus transformed Saul, the church's greatest persecutor, the greatest enemy, and he turned him into the greatest ambassador. It was an international mess, right? Damascus is kind of in the Nabatean over there, the empire, different empire, Arabia. He goes into Jerusalem, into Judea. He causes all kinds of problems, and they send him to Tarsus, way up in Asia Minor. It's an international thing that's going on with Paul. And the next story in Peter is going to be Cornelius. So Jews moving into this amazing, huge commander of the Roman Empire, this amazing, huge thing. But in this story, it's a man who's paralyzed, just sitting there in a very small place. And a bunch of widows in an upper room in a nobody town that no one cares about. We see him in this huge, amazing place where obvious impossible, but also in the little nooks and crannies of our lives where we are dealing with the impossible that we're dealing with, he's there too. Not just in the big news articles that are going around the world. That's an amazing thing. Just stop and think about that. Wherever you're dealing with God, wherever you're at, whatever you think it might be too small a problem with God, you're not important enough, he's right there in this. I love that about this story. See, the widows were of little account culturally. And here's God just caring about normal folks, as we call ourselves. To orient you, I want to give you some direction so you can understand a little bit about where this is at, where this is happening. Here are the locations of the 2 cities. I was trying to work on the laser pointer earlier, that's why the screen all messed up. But Jerusalem is at the bottom of the red line, and as you go up, that first stop is Lydda, and the second stop is Joppa, right on the coast. Next week, we're going to talk about him making that trip up to Caesarea, which is the furthest red area up there where it says Samaria. But right now, he's just moving from Jerusalem out toward the coast. He's still in predominantly Jewish area at this point. And again, the author implies here, I think, that Ananias and Tabitha are already part of the church, which Philip actually went on that line first. So Philip went from Jerusalem through Lydda, Joppa, going in to do his ministry. He starts these churches, and Peter shows up, and that's where he's doing this particular ministry. So what you're seeing here and what's happening on the large scale, just kind of a teaching moment about the book of Acts, is that you're seeing this first movement of the church really pushing out of Jerusalem and into Samaria and into the Gentile territory. It's setting up the next story because Peter is moving from an area of purity to closer and closer to uncleanness, what had previously been uncleanness, and towards Gentiles. So there's a mixture here of people, and that's why you have Dorcas, name is Greek, and the Tabitha, they get the Hebrew name. You've got these mixture that Peter is kind of moving into slowly. God's kind of preparing him for this next big story Brad's going to talk about next week with Cornelius. And so what you have here is it's hard for us to imagine how big a deal it is for Jews to say that Gentiles can be a part of Judaism without being circumcised, without having to go through all this stuff. And so here, Peter needs a lot of validation that Jesus and that God is on his side, that he absolutely and utterly represents the God of Abraham, Jacob, and Isaac and Jacob, right? He needs this to be a center of things, that he is a valid missionary of God. And these miracles are doing that validation that's going to help carry it forward. So that's the major reason we see this included in this section, because I have a feeling that Peter did a lot of miracles. Not just these two, but in the 10 years or so between when Paul left and Paul comes back. We have this amazing story here. And so I want to take a quick look at each move from unclean to the holy vessel. In other words, from Ananias and Tabitha. I want to look at both Ananias and Tabitha. Ananias hasn't walked in a long time. And we don't know what broke him. We don't know whether it was disease, born this way, injury, whether it was someone did it to him, whether he did it to himself. But he's not allowed in the temple. He's not allowed in holy places. He's not allowed in sin. He's an unclean person, so to speak. And Peter sweeps into his life and says, Jesus Christ heals you. Get up and spread it. That's what it says. Get up and spread it. Our translation, my translation, most translations add your bed. Just because that seems to likely maybe be what he might be spreading, but it doesn't have anything about a bed. Many people think, in fact, I think most commentators say they think it might mean spread the table, make a food, because that's kind of what you do after an event like this. But all that's just a guess. I think Peter left this vague on purpose, because I'm sure he's tired of spreading the bed. I'm sure he's tired of being on that bed. I'm not sure why he'd be like, spread the bed. It's time to lay down and go, time to lay down again. But maybe it means he can be hospitable like the table. But you know what spreads here? What actually gets spread? Read the text. Look back over it if you have your Bibles open. What does he actually end up spreading? The word. The gospel spreads. People all over Lydda find out about Jesus. I can't help but recall Isaiah chapter 52:7. When I read this story, it just popped into my mind. A man who hasn't walked in so long. How lovely on the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who announces peace and brings good news of happiness, who announces salvation and says to Zion, your God reigns. Who better to do that than the man who has never been able to use his feet to get up and go and tell the good news that salvation is available through Jesus Christ, and say, God really does reign. He really is in charge. I mean, that's just exciting to think about this guy standing up and saying what Isaiah said would happen so long ago. Getting up is good news you've got to share. Getting up, when God gets into you and he energizes you and he revives your life, you got to get up and share it. You want to be those good feet who say, you know what, I've been dead inside for a long time. I want the world to know who this amazing God is. It's fulfilling your purpose. He's fulfilling his entire created purpose, which is glorifying God, being his image. You know, hope spreads like wildfire to the town of Joppa, where Tabitha lives. This Tabitha, she took care of widows, apparently. She was obviously an amazing lady already. She had basically gotten sick all of a sudden and died. And they sent for Peter, and you should take time, I think, really to imagine the scene. If you're doing a devotional or something, take time to imagine the scene of Peter walking in where these poor widows are showing Peter the precious gifts and garments and love that Tabitha has given them out of the graciousness of her heart. Their hearts are broken that Tabitha has died. It's heartrending, but God isn't just involved in important people. Again, he's not just involved in international politics. He's in this small upper room full of grieving widows. He sends them out and prays. And God must have told him to say, Tabitha, arise. Peter helps her up, and he presents her alive, and the gospel spreads wildly. No tragedy, not even death itself, will stop the good news of God's great renewal from spreading all over the world. That's what this is about. That not death, not paralysis, nothing can stop what God's going to do in this world, in this community, and the salvation he brings. See, we live in a time which needs renewal, don't we? All around us, people are suffering, they're struggling, and they're trying to do their best to get on both feet every morning and get going. Maybe you need renewal. Maybe you need hope and purpose. You need the sand to return to your shore, and you're trying everything you can. And there are a lot of places out there trying to offer people hope and motivation, but they leave people feeling burned, and sometimes quite literally. I was reading a story, and back in about 2017, but in 2016, this motivational speaker, huge guy, really popular, named Tony Robbins, he encouraged people to find renewal in their lives and courage to walk across a 20-foot long coal pit fire, right? 20 feet long of coals that are super hot. And they were supposed to, get this, they were supposed to release the power within. 30 of these individuals burned their feet badly, so badly that 30 of them went to the hospital because, here's this, the staff didn't let it cool enough. That entire time, it was a setup to make people think they had made it through a tough situation without actually having gone through the tough situation. So that's what the world does a lot of times. They're trying to encourage you. They throw these false things at you, and you get burned by them. These people got literally burned, but you'll find that, oh yeah, I have the courage to do this amazing thing, and then I'm going to get life out of this. Oh, and you go back, and it's still dry, and it's still dark. And I feel bad for these people, I really do. I don't mean to just mock them. But there's not that much strength within us without Jesus. And I realize that some people feel the same way with a church experience, to be honest with you. That they have been burned just as bad by churches. But that's not a Jesus encounter. There's a lot of people, a lot of places, a lot of times where we're broken and we're not perfect. And we do things we shouldn't say or shouldn't do. And there has to be a lot of grace in that. But sometimes the best grace encounter or Jesus encounter comes in forgiveness in a place like this. But here's the thing. A church experience explodes here from this little band of widows encountering Jesus. Just think about that. The only way for real renewal that brings life from death is an encounter with Jesus. He is the hope of our salvation. He is your hope of getting up when life has you pinned down. The Spirit is blowing in your direction this morning. Ask God to give you a new breath, to renew your feet, to know His glory. Because without Jesus, Peter would just be a motivational speaker, telling dead people to walk. Wouldn't do much good. But that's what most of this is. That's what most of we see on television. You can do it, you can do it, you can do it, and you can get up for a little bit and then back down again. We all need Jesus to fulfill our own calling to glorify God. Every Christian's calling. First thing you have to do is you have to make sure that the very first time that you have encountered Jesus once for salvation, you have to know in the deepest part of who you are that you have had at least an encounter with Jesus before you can be a person who goes and takes Jesus to other people. If you're saying, look, I am totally broken, I am totally empty, I have no encounter with Jesus, I am that dead shoreline, then the first thing you need to do before you go taking Jesus to other people, as though that's going to fix the problem, is you need to go to the throne and have a moment with Him. Because I want to be doing what Peter does, but I can't get there until I make sure I have an encounter. And plus, Peter had plenty of those encounters, we know. And it took him quite a while to get to this point. And maybe it takes you quite a while. But you can't go out doing ministry and saying, we're going to grow the church, or we're going to grow this ministry, or I'm going to grow my family to the Lord. You can't do those things unless you yourself are having an encounter with Jesus. So this morning, before we go any further, you have to ask yourself, am I having an encounter with Jesus? And the rest of the sermon for you is going to be, do I want that to be true in my life? Maybe you've had an encounter with Jesus and you need to hear what's coming up next, because this is really, really super important, and it's going to be crossing over with the Bible study that they're doing on Wednesday nights. But this is something that I've been saying for a long time, and that is all true ministry is Jesus' ministry. You got to get that in your head and in your heart. If you're going to do ministry, if you're going to do stuff for the church, all ministry is Jesus' ministry. You don't have a ministry. I don't have a ministry without Jesus. He's the center of it. It's His. I don't have my ministry. I don't own that ministry. When I talk about my ministry, I just mean to be using the word my as though I'm doing this ministry of Jesus's. That's all it should mean. This is a major theme of Acts. Look at Acts 1:1. Luke says that his gospel was this. His gospel, so that's the gospel of Luke, was about all that Jesus began to do and teach. This book, Acts, is all that Jesus is teaching and doing through His disciples all the way through to us today. This is when the gospel is about what He began to do it. Acts is the continuation of Jesus' ministry. It says it just as plain as day in Acts 1:1. Again, note that Peter says when he goes to Ananias, Jesus Christ heals you. Not I heal you, not I say a magical incantation, but somewhere, like I said, Jesus must have told him, I'm going to heal him. Peter doesn't heal. You don't heal. I don't heal. Jesus heals. Can we be prepared for it? Can we know Him well? Yes, absolutely. But Jesus does that work. Now, the Tabitha story is more subtle and I think more deep. It's amazing little connections all through this story. This story reflects the raising of the widows by both Elijah and by Jesus and Jairus' daughter in this book of Mark. In Jairus' story in the book of Mark, Jesus sends mourners out, just like Peter. He says, Talitha cum, or Talitha, arise. Peter says, Tabitha, arise. One letter difference. In other words, and it's the same thing. Then he takes her by the hand, helps her up, says the same things that Jesus says. He's doing the same thing. He's not imitating Jesus here. The point of it is that this is Jesus' ministry working through Paul. Does that make sense? It's not a magical thing that Peter's doing and saying, okay, I'm going to do the exact same steps that Jesus is doing. The point that Luke is trying to get across is Jesus is still active. He's still destroying death. He's still in charge. It's an amazing thing, because the whole point, this reflection, I would say, of both Elijah, which I don't have time to go into. Go look up Elijah and Elisha raising a dead child, and look up and read Jairus' story in Mark. But it demonstrates that this is the same God from the Old Testament and the Gospel that is at work both in this story and today. We kind of take that for granted. But there's a lot of people in Peter's time in particular, and all through the early church, where Christianity is a different religion, or it's a different God. No, God is still just in Jerusalem. And so this is an argument that essentially saying that God is not just in Jerusalem, he's with his people, right? Because part of the surprise here is that ministry isn't a place anymore, like the temple, but Christ's agents who carry on his work by his power. What I really love is that ministry isn't just obvious miracles, like raising people from the dead, because if that was the basics of ministry, most of us have not raised anyone from the dead in the last few weeks, and therefore we wouldn't have done any ministry. You should need to see these as signs of what God is doing when you read this. And you need to read it, I think, more like a jump start for the ministry Tabitha would do. Caring and loving on widows. He takes her and he presents her back to these widows and says, my ministry through this lady is still alive through her. And she goes back, obvious, I think it's implied, she goes back and she does this ministry after an encounter with Jesus. That spreads to today. There's actually a ministry called Dorcas Ministries that does amazing work around the world. It doesn't have like a straight line like it's 2,000 years old, but they named it after her to do this same thing. But we have our own today. We have the food pantry. And it's not working so that we please God. It's working because we've had an encounter with God and we want people to know that we love them. We have the nursing home. Or anytime you tell your neighbor just about Jesus, that is the ministry of Jesus. That's his ministry. And Jesus shares his ministry with us. He gives us a place to serve in his ministry. This is amazing for Christians to realize. It removes the pressure to be special, right? I mean, it does for me. It says you don't have to be special because ministry here is not in Peter's hands. The success of ministry is not in Peter's hands. It's in Jesus' hands. Ministry success is in Jesus' hands. And this matters in a million small ways. I had a class, Derek, is he in here? I'm not sure if he's in here right now. Oh, he's up there. Derek and I have gone through some chaplaincy type stuff. And I'll tell you this, he didn't have the problem I had. My problem was that I was petrified, absolutely petrified, to just cold call, walk into people's room and pretend I could minister to them, pretend. And I was so intimidated that I would walk from room to room as slowly as I possibly could without looking like I was a patient. I was scared I was going to mess up. I was scared I was going to say something wrong, hurt someone's feelings, and they'd kick me out of the hospital, right? I knew most of these people, I probably didn't have anything they needed to hear me. I wasn't a counselor, a psychologist, or anything that some people seem to want. But teachers started to tell you this in training. It's that patients often express that when a pastor or a chaplain or a Christian brother or sister walk into a room where a storm is raging in their life, it's like God has finally made it to them. It's like God has arrived on the scene. When I realized that I was only a secondary guest in the room, they told me this, but it takes a while to experience that. The pressure to perform or say the exact right thing washed the fear away. It was just gone. And I know a lot of people are scared to say something about Jesus. They're scared to say the wrong thing. You're scared to talk about Jesus to the people. Just do it. The best you can. Prepare the best you can, then go do it and ask God to be the one to tell you what to do and say, because he's the one who has the power to change someone's heart. You could say the exact right, perfect thing, and if they're not listening to God, it doesn't matter what you say. They're not going to care. You can stumble through things, barely make sense to yourself, and if God is working in that room, I tell you, that life will change. It's just how it is. It goes back to this very basic thing. All true ministry is Jesus' ministry. And that's something to hold on to with all your heart, might, and soul when you're going out through your day trying to do what you need to do for Jesus. What many people don't want is a person representing Jesus, saying they represent Jesus, to come into the room and talk about themselves, to pretend nothing else is wrong, to try to cheer them up. I'm sure cheer people up, but do what Peter does with the widows. What does he do? This is where you look at Scripture carefully. He listens carefully. He goes in, they show him things. He sits there with them sometime, and they tell him about their love and relationship with Tabitha. He goes in there and he does that. He prays diligently. He sends them out. He has this moment of prayer. I think he's asking God for direction, asking him to respond. You're asking God to show himself, show him what you want to do. And then you follow his lead wherever it goes. And then you present what God has done as though it's what God has done, not what you have done. You glorify him. That's it. That's the nature of caring, loving, and doing ministry with people. Don't say to yourself, I've got to perform so amazingly. God with us, he's with us when we're going to the nursing home. And you'll have some time. I hope that you all go and take part in that. It's every first and third Friday of the month at 10 a.m. at the Heights. And I hope you have a chance to go. And you have to experience this. You go, I don't know what to say to those people. I don't know what to do. Nobody does. You go and you love people and you care about them. They don't even know what to say to you. And some of them can't even talk. You are God's presence in their life, showing up and caring and loving you. And yes, they do need our touch, our presence. But that's only secondary, because what they really need, and what most of these people really know they need, is the presence and touch of Jesus. And that's what we do when we go. You might say, well, Jesus is everywhere. They don't need us to bring Jesus into the room, because God is everywhere. But God works through people. That's what he chose to do. That's how he chose to work. Could he and does he occasionally wildly do something without any connection to a person? Yes. But go read Acts. Go read the Bible. 98% or so God's working through someone. Because what people need, the way God's made it, is that you'll find that you're entering into the blessing of communion with people. Communion, or community, comes between you and them and God, and that's what you have to offer. There's no ministry without him. No ministry that is just mine. And every ministry without his vibrant presence will destroy you. It'll dry you up. It'll suck you dry. If you try to do ministry to try to impress, to try to earn something, it will suck you dry. It's already hard when you've had an encounter with Jesus. You will not be able to stand it. So how do you keep your spiritual heart beating? Because there's a danger in this story of thinking that all of Tabitha's life is about getting up and serving and serving and serving and serving. But all this serving, she ends up dead for some. I don't know if it happens to just be that way, or that, she's worked to death. But I could tell you that it doesn't take long to go from a happy servant to a burned out servant if you think that spiritual life is all about being busy for God. God does have ministry work for you, for me. But notice what happens with everyone in the story of Acts. They move from an encounter with God to working with God, and not the other way around. It always goes from an encounter of being with God and having his presence to working for God. If you think the other way, if you think I'll work for God and then he'll give me an encounter, then you've moved into we've moved from a grace relationship to a works-based relationship. Enriching ministry derives from powerful encounters, intimate prayers, and humble listening to Jesus. Because it is his ministry and he has to lead it, or you'll get dried up, just like I said. You have to have that encounter with Jesus first. You need that encounter with Jesus to move that ministry. Because you'll try to shine God's glory like the sun, but nobody's going to feel the warmth. God has never asked you to be enough for anyone, and especially not for him. He wants to be moving His grace and His life and His power through you. He's not saying, look, I'll give you an encounter with me if you do X, Y, and Z. All three people here are also entirely unfit for an encounter with God. Do you see that? All three, even Peter. I mean, he messed up so many times in the Gospels, it's crazy. You have to know the background of him. But that's just where you have to be to have an encounter with God. You have to know that you're unfit to have an encounter with Him to get the encounter with Him. At least almost every time here you see anything like that. Anything gaudy, anything hugely arrogant, meeting up with God, like Simon the magicians and some of these people who meet God, Ananias and Sapphira, when they come as something that they're proud of or something they're bringing to God, and it's not, they think they're worthy or have done anything good, then boom, they get put in their place. To have an encounter with God, you go, man, you know what? I am not, a lot of us think, I'm not worthy of an encounter with God. I need to do these things to have an encounter with God. No, you don't. It's total surrender. You have a man who's completely paralyzed and a person who's dead. They're not bringing anything to the table. It's the one spiritual thing you have to realize in life. The moment you're full of arrogance is the moment the Spirit will not be able to work through you. I don't want to take that as an insult. Take it as an unwarranted, gracious opportunity in your life. That's what God's doing. I found one key thing that demonstrates if God is active in your life to me. This is one of many other things, but one I think is important is, can you take a Sabbath? Can you take a rest? We talk about work and work and work and work for God, but can you take a rest? Can you trust that God is sufficient when you're silent? Can you trust that He's working when you take a rest and you're just resting in Him? I think Sabbath as the first day of the week for Christians is helpful, simply because we know that the whole week's work depends on an encounter with God at the beginning. So, a lot of people almost think of Sunday as the last day of the week. It's really the first day of the week. And it's this day you have an encounter with God that takes you through the rest of the week. Whereas the old Sabbath almost, I won't say it was this way because it wasn't, but it almost could think of it as having to work, and then you finally get to rest. Here, we rest in Him so that we can work for Him. And it's just a helpful thing to think about. I don't want you to think that that's exactly how it was designed, but that's a helpful way for me to think about it. This isn't just doing ministry or the exceptional for a people. You can trust Him. In other words, we see Him raising people and doing proud, doing. He is going to be working through the mundane and the normal. And the question is can you rest in what He's doing in your life? Are you satisfied that God's going to do what He needs to do in your life? This is one of the biggest questions I think most Christians miss out on. Are you satisfied with what God's giving you? Because if you can't rest, you're not satisfied. That's a tough thing to think about because we all want more. We live in a culture of more. This morning, whether you need God to move you from spiritual paralysis, isolation, or exhaustion and allow God to have an encounter in your life, I hope that's what you're here for this morning because the wind is blowing in the right direction. He's here and He's available. What God can do in your life and through your life is so much more than you will ever realize. Unless you have that encounter with Him, unless you stabilize yourself in Him. Because He has created you to be His hands and His feet. And the whole world will know that you belong to Him. And you might think, I'll never be Peter. I'll never get the healing and the purpose of Tabitha. But in God's hands, people will see God's glory in you too. There's this amazing little poem I love. And I don't usually close with poems, but it's a story poem. And I want to share that with you this morning. Maybe you've heard it. It is by Myra Welsh. "'Twas battered and scarred, and the auctioneer though it was scarcely worth his while to waste much time on this old violin, but he held it up with a smile. "What am I bidding, good folks?" he cried. "Who'll start the bidding for me? A dollar, then two, only two? $2, who'll make it three? $3 once, $3 twice, going for three, but no." From the room far back, a gray-haired man came forward and picked up the bow. Then wiping the dust from the old violin and tightening up the loose strings, he played a melody pure and sweet as caroling angels sings. The music ceased, and the auctioneer, with a voice that was quiet and low, said, "What am I bid for the old violin?" And he held it up with the bow. $1,000, and who will make it two? 2,000, and who will make it three? 3,000 once, 3,000 twice, and going and gone, said he. And the people cheered, and some of them cried, "We do not quite understand. What changed its worth?" Swift came the reply, the touch of a master's hand. And many a man with life out of tune, all battered and bruised with hardship, is auctioned cheap to a thoughtless crowd, much like that old violin. A mess of pottage, a glass of wine, a game, and he travels on. He is going once, he is going twice, he is going and almost gone. But the master comes, and the foolish crowd never can quite understand the worth of a soul and the change that is wrought by the touch of the master's hand.